Hello, we're here at Innovista Law, House of the TCPA Defense Force. My name is Ernesto Mendieta.
And I'm John Nelson.
Hi, John. Today we're going to talk about a very basic question, but it's a threshold question that I'm sure a lot of our viewers will be interested in. So, does the TCPA apply to text messaging?
The language of the statute itself might indicate otherwise, but yes, it does. It does apply to text messaging.
Right. As you said, the language, I have read the TCPA and in no way or in no part does it talk about SMS or text messaging, right?
That's correct. In the TCPA itself, it only ever mentions calls and faxes,
Calls and
facsimiles.
faxes. But then why do we know, or why does everybody care? And well, now we know, but why does it apply to text messaging?
Sure. So I think, and this will take a little bit of history of the TCPA, I guess, to fully understand. But it's important to remember that the TCPA is an old statute. It was enacted in 1991. Which compared to where we are now digitally, obviously, is far different than where we were then. And it's especially important to remember that the first commercial text message wasn't sent actually until 1993. But the courts and the FCC, in interpreting the TCPA and Congress's intent in enacting that law, have concluded on multiple occasions and repeatedly that text messages fall into that definition, to the calls definition.
Which makes sense. It's a reasonable interpretation. There was no way of them including SMS or text messaging in 1991. Impossible. So it's a reasonable interpretation that the FCC and the courts have made.
Certainly.
So now that we have defined and determined that the TCPA does apply to text messaging, it's important to clarify that this is a broad scope, because you may think of text messaging, one person getting his phone out, texting a family member or texting other ones, typing exactly what he wants. But this is not exactly what happens with businesses communicating with their customers.
Right. And no one expects, a business to sit there and individually text the potentially hundreds of thousands of consumers that they are trying to reach on a daily basis. So a lot of these companies, as we've talked about before, use various platforms, computer platforms, from which they text large numbers, or a large number of numbers at one time. And again, this might not be what someone thinks when they think, I'm texting a person. It might not look like that even in using the platform. It could look like you're simply emailing a generally large group of people. But it's important to note that platforms have fallen within the definition of the phrase automatic telephone dialing system, ATDS, which again is the language used actually in the TCPA itself.
So these auto dialers, we know now that there's a lot of discussion of what's the proper meaning of it.
Certainly, and this has been the case for quite some time. The FCC and the courts have never really been able to clearly define what is and isn't an auto dialer, and this caused a lot of confusion, not just on the calling side, but also on the texting side. Are these various platform providers actually engaging in and using an auto dialer? And it's very clear that the FCC's language and interpretation of this caused problems, not just for individual businesses, but also for the courts. And in fact, this created such a problem, such confusion, that just recently, in March of 2018, the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, really one of the hard-hitting courts when it comes to administrative law and looking at agency issues and interpretations, they struck down the way the FCC had defined ATDS. And currently, we are seeing a reinterpretation of that phrase. We are seeing the FCC just recently release a public notice looking for comments on how that phrase should be interpreted. So it's something that is changing, but in order to be safe, not sorry, a lot of people who use these platforms should be taking that precaution, should be thinking it's an auto dialer that's making these text messages subject to the TCPA.
So with this open procedure by the FCC, there's a chance for our viewers and for the industry to engage and participate with the FCC in giving comments and trying to give tips and recommendations and just points of view of what an auto dialer should mean, what much should it cover, and at the end it's just trying the FCC to get it right.
Definitely. And you know, this is something that a lot of businesses don't think is important. They think, you know, it's just like if I write a letter to my congressman, I'm not going to get a response. I'm going to get the same generic thing. You know, the FCC is required to read the comments that you submit to them. They're required to read. They're required to respond to those comments. And the more pieces of the industry, of businesses that engage and advocate their position, you know, the greater that force is. So it really is a way to create change and to perhaps create a more neutral and true definition of automatic telephone dialing system that really gets to the heart of what Congress intended.
Nice. So participation by the industry could cause good results in this case.
Certainly, certainly.
Okay, so to conclude today, I think the answer is pretty clear. We discussed it a little, but the TCPA does apply to text messaging. Thank you, John. This is Innovista Law, the House of the TCPA Defense Force.